A glittering yacht party, a pregnant wife, and a millionaire husband whose pride explodes into violence. Before anyone can react, he shoves her into the sea, right in front of the guests and their cameras. But what he never realized is that she is not powerless. She holds the very keys to the empire he thinks he controls. What follows is a story of arrogance, betrayal, and a shocking reversal of fate that will leave you speechless. Trust me, you will not see the ending until we dive in. Let us know what time you are listening and where you are tuning in from. Drop a comment below. We would love to hear from you. The ocean was calm, the sun high above, and the sound of glasses clinking filled the air. On the deck of a luxury yacht, guests laughed and posed for photos, believing they were attending just another lavish celebration hosted by a man who had everything. He was a millionaire with power, charm, and an ego that towered over the waves. He wanted the world to see his wealth. He wanted the cameras to record his glory. But beneath the glitter of champagne and the polished wood of the deck, another story was unfolding. A story that would leave the crowd in shock. His wife stood nearby, her hands resting on her pregnant belly. She wore a long, flowing dress, elegant yet modest, her face pale but steady. She had endured his temper in private, but today his anger broke into the open. The guests noticed his clenched jaw, the way his glass of wine shook in his hand, and the sudden sharpness in his voice. At first they thought it was a simple argument, the kind of marital dispute that wealthy couples could afford to hide. But then the volume rose. His voice carried over the sea breeze, every word soaked in venom. The guests tried to look away. They whispered to each other, shifting nervously as if their silence could dissolve the tension. Yet their phones were already in hand. Some recorded discreetly, pretending to check messages, while others held their cameras high. They sensed what was about to happen, and then it came. The millionaire shouted, his face twisted in rage. He raised his hand, not to strike but to point at her, as though she were an intruder in his world. He accused her of disrespect, of daring to challenge him, of daring to exist outside the shadow he had created. The wife said nothing. She looked at him with quiet strength, her fingers tightening against her stomach, her body trembling but her eyes unbroken. That defiance enraged him even more. He stepped closer, his shoes echoing on the polished deck, his arms sweeping wide as if to cast her aside with words alone. But words were not enough for him. He reached out, grabbed her shoulder, and with one violent push, he sent her backward. Gasps erupted from the crowd as her body slipped from the deck. The splash was louder than any music. The ocean swallowed her in a single moment. For a breathless second, there was silence. The party froze. Glasses stopped mid-air, conversations cut off, laughter choked in throats. All eyes turned to the spot where she had disappeared. Her dress floated up briefly, a pale shape against the dark water, then vanished under the waves. Screams broke out. Someone shouted for help. Crew members rushed to the side, throwing life rings, scanning the water desperately. Guests leaned over the railings, their phones still recording, their voices panicked. The yacht was no longer a place of glamour. It had become a stage for horror. And yet, the millionaire stood still. He adjusted his suit jacket, his expression hard, as though nothing had happened. He muttered a single order to the crew, telling them to continue the evening. His voice was calm now, but that calm was not peace. It was arrogance, a declaration that he had the power to erase what the crowd had just witnessed. But he was wrong. Every scream, every splash, every horrified gasp was captured by the cameras in the hands of his guests. Within minutes, those images would fly across the digital world. Millions would see. Millions would judge. And the act he believed would silence her forever had instead become the first spark of his downfall. The water had barely settled when the weight of silence fell upon the yacht. For a moment, guests hoped what they had seen was a mistake, a misunderstanding, something that could be explained away. But there was no mistaking it. A millionaire had just pushed his pregnant wife into the ocean before their eyes. The truth was too sharp, too real, and the entire gathering felt the sting of it. Phones rose higher. What began as discreet recordings now became open broadcasts. Screens glowed as guests sent clips across social media. The sound of gasps and frantic voices filled the air, each frame capturing the raw horror of the act. Already, hashtags began to spread, names whispered like sparks ready to ignite a firestorm. The world was watching, and the yacht had become a stage for disgrace. Crew members rushed to pull the woman from the waves, but the damage was done. She was dragged back onto the deck, her hair soaked, her face pale, her body trembling. She coughed seawater, clutching her stomach as her dress clung to her skin. Cameras focused on her fragile form. No amount of wealth could hide the image of a woman who had just been cast into the sea by the man who vowed to protect her. The millionaire turned, his face cold and composed, as though the moment had never happened. He barked at the guests to calm down, to continue with their drinks, to pretend that nothing had disturbed the celebration. His arrogance was not only shocking, it was humiliating for everyone present. He acted as though his wife was not a human being, but an object to be discarded. Whispers turned into angry murmurs. Some guests could not believe the audacity. Others were too stunned to move, their hands trembling as they held their phones steady. The videos captured every detail. The moment he pushed her, the splash, the cries, the icy command to resume the party. By the time the yacht returned to shore, the clips had already gone viral. Millions of strangers across the world would soon watch in disbelief. The humiliation was not limited to the act itself. It was in his refusal to show remorse, in the way he straightened his tie and smirked at the chaos around him. It was in the cruel glances he threw at his wife as she was wrapped in blankets by the crew. His eyes carried the message that she was nothing, that no one would ever believe her over him. But the crowd believed her. They had seen it, they had recorded it, and their silence could not erase the truth that now lived on countless screens. The humiliation became public not because he wanted it, but because his arrogance had blinded him to the power of witnesses. Onshore, the news spread faster than the tide. Social feeds filled with clips, captions, and outrage. Headlines shouted about the millionaire who shoved his pregnant wife into the ocean. Television anchors debated his character. Analysts questioned his empire, and strangers demanded justice. The world was no longer celebrating his wealth. It was condemning his cruelty. The wife, fragile and shaken, was placed into an ambulance as the cameras followed. Her humiliation was not private anymore. It was shared by thousands, then millions, as images of her soaked body and trembling hands lit up screens across the globe. She had been humiliated by her husband, but his arrogance had turned that humiliation back onto himself. And so, what he believed would be a display of control had become the opposite. His image of power began to crumble, not because of the act alone, but because the act had been witnessed. The world had seen him strip away her dignity. The world had heard the splash, and the world would not forget. The hospital lights were cold and unyielding. Fluorescent bulbs buzzed overhead, casting their pale glow across the sterile room. Machines beeped softly, measuring every fragile breath, every tremor of life within her. The woman lay on the narrow bed, her hair still damp from the sea, her face drained of color. She held her stomach tightly, as if her arms alone could shield the unborn child from the violence that had just torn her world apart. The humiliation of the yacht still echoed in her mind, but now there was only silence. No crowd, no cameras, no flashing lights. Only the sound of her own shallow breathing. The salt of the ocean clung to her skin, mixed with tears she refused to shed. She had always known his temper. She had always known the danger. But never had she imagined that he would push her to the edge of life and death in front of the world. Her parents sat nearby, their faces carved by worry and grief. Her mother clasped her hands together, lips moving in silent prayer. Her father sat rigid in the chair, fists clenched so tightly the knuckles turned white. They had witnessed the horror themselves, their daughter falling into the sea, their grandchild nearly lost before birth. Yet even in their fury, they remained still, because anger could wait. Her survival could not. Doctors entered and exited the room with quiet urgency. They spoke in clinical tones, discussing blood pressure, oxygen levels, risk factors. Each word pressed against her heart like a weight. "Rest," they said. "Observation," they warned. "Risk," they repeated. She nodded, not because she understood, but because she knew she had no choice. Every instruction was a command for life itself. She lay still, her mind spiraling. Pain ran through her body, sharp and unforgiving, but the greater pain was invisible. It was the pain of betrayal, of humiliation, of knowing that the man she had once trusted had chosen to treat her not as a partner but as an obstacle. In his eyes, she was disposable. In his hands, she had been cast away. Yet even as the pain consumed her, she did not allow herself to break. She would not cry in front of her parents. She would not let them see the full depth of her despair. She turned her face toward the wall, hiding her trembling lips, swallowing every sob that threatened to escape. Her silence became her shield, her way of holding on to the last piece of dignity that he had tried to strip from her. Outside the hospital, the world raged. News outlets played the footage again and again. Strangers argued online, demanding accountability. Commentators spoke of cruelty, power, and justice. But inside the room, she knew none of that could change the truth that pressed against her chest. She had been hurt, her child had been put at risk, and the man responsible still believed he held control. Her parents whispered to each other, torn between their desire to comfort her and their fear of speaking too much. They wanted justice, but they also wanted peace. They wanted her to rest, but they knew rest alone would not heal what had been broken. They sat close, not with words, but with presence, as if their silence could stitch together the pieces of her heart. The woman closed her eyes. In that silence, she felt both broken and unyielding. Her body was weak, her spirit shaken, yet somewhere deep within, something stronger was taking root. She did not know it yet, but her suffering was not the end, it was the beginning. For in the depths of humiliation and pain, a seed of resolve was planted. And though she did not speak it aloud, the silence in that hospital room carried the first breath of a vow that one day she would rise. While the world debated the cruelty of the act, the woman lay in silence, healing not only her body but also her resolve. She was no ordinary victim. Behind the pale face on the hospital bed, behind the fragile frame clutching her stomach, lived a truth that her husband had never cared to uncover. He had believed her powerless. He had believed her dependent on his wealth and status. But the reality was far more dangerous for him. She was not just his wife. She was the daughter of a global titan, the only heir of a financial empire that stretched across continents. From childhood, she had been groomed in the language of power, boardrooms, and balance sheets. She had walked through offices where fortunes were made and lost with a single decision. She had listened to her father speak of leverage, alliances, and the weight of signatures. What her husband had never realized was that his empire was not truly his. It rested on foundations her family had built. The irony was cruel. The very company that had given him his wealth, the very deals that elevated him into the spotlight, were tied to shares and votes that belonged not to him, but to her. He had walked the world as if untouchable, never suspecting that the woman standing silently by his side held the keys to his fortune. Her parents, seated in the quiet of the hospital room, knew this truth well. Her father, though still, carried the steel of a man who had fought battles in boardrooms larger than any courtroom. He had watched in silence as the news portrayed his son-in-law as a king. He had waited, knowing that arrogance always builds its own destruction. Now he saw his daughter broken, but he also knew what lay beneath her silence. He knew she held the power to erase the man who had humiliated her. The doctors spoke in low voices. Journalists clamored outside. Social media burned with outrage. Yet within the hospital walls, another kind of preparation was taking shape. A hidden storm was gathering. The woman asked for files, for her attorney, for her father's closest advisors. Her voice was soft, but her words were deliberate. She wanted documentation. She wanted records. She wanted everything that would remind her husband of the truth he had ignored. Her mother wept quietly, fearing the toll it would take on her daughter's fragile health. But the daughter's eyes burned with a light stronger than pain. She was no longer thinking of herself as a victim. She was remembering who she was. Every signature that bore her name, every share certificate that carried her weight, every clause hidden in the contracts her husband had never read, all of it formed a weapon sharper than any blade. Her husband continued to strut across headlines, mocking her absence, appearing at clubs and parties with his mistress, laughing as though nothing had happened. He believed the scandal would pass, that his wealth would shield him, that his wife would remain silent. He did not see the trap forming around him. He did not know that the silence he mocked was not weakness, it was calculation. For now, The world still saw her as the fragile woman who had been pushed into the sea. They pitied her, they sympathized with her, but soon they would see something else. Soon, they would learn that the woman who survived humiliation was not waiting for rescue. She was preparing to take back everything he thought was his. And when that truth finally surfaced, it would not only shake him, it would shatter the image of power he had built. The man who had once looked untouchable would learn that the greatest threat to his empire had been lying beside him all along. The hospital room that once echoed with silence now carried whispers of strategy. The woman was no longer the trembling figure pulled from the sea. She was still weak, still fragile in body, but her mind was sharper than it had ever been. Every breath she took reminded her of what was at stake. Every heartbeat of the child inside her reminded her of why she could not remain silent. She called for her attorney, not just any lawyer, but one who had stood beside her family for decades, a man who knew the hidden structure of the empire her husband believed he controlled. He arrived quietly, his suit plain, his demeanor calm, but his briefcase carried the weight of years of secrets. He sat at her bedside, listened carefully to her words, and nodded. He did not see a victim before him. He saw a client ready to fight. Her father joined them, his presence a wall of strength. He spoke little, but his eyes burned with restrained fury. For years, he had allowed his son-in-law to bask in the illusion of power. He had let the man strut across stages, shake hands with politicians, and smile for cameras. But now, the mask was gone. The arrogance of that push into the ocean had revealed everything. It was no longer a family matter, it was war. Documents were spread across the table. Contracts, share certificates, records of board meetings. Each page carried a story her husband had ignored. He had signed agreements without reading them, too proud to imagine that his wife could hold the deciding vote. He had moved money through hidden channels, thinking no one would notice. But the paper trail was clear. His greed had written his downfall. The woman studied every line with quiet determination. She marked sections with trembling fingers, her lawyer explaining each clause in steady tones. Evidence of financial misconduct was laid out, piece by piece, forming a picture that would soon be undeniable. Hidden accounts, shell companies, inflated invoices. The empire he flaunted was built not only on arrogance but on fraud. At night, when the hospital grew quiet, she made calls. Trusted allies from her father's network answered, ready to move when the time came. Some were journalists who had waited for proof. Others were financial investigators who had long suspected corruption. They all agreed to remain silent for now. Timing was everything. If they moved too soon, he might escape. If they waited too long, he might destroy more. Meanwhile, her husband grew louder in the public eye. He appeared at clubs, his mistress at his side, laughing for cameras as if nothing had touched him. He mocked the outrage online, claiming the world exaggerated. He told his investors the scandal would fade. He dismissed his wife as weak, as broken, as irrelevant. Each word he spoke was arrogance, feeding the fire of his eventual destruction. But the woman did not answer him publicly. She remained silent, letting him believe he had won. In truth, she was building a fortress of evidence, allies, and legal authority. Her silence was not surrender. It was the preparation before the strike. Every visitor to her hospital room left with instructions. Every file that crossed her hands was marked, copied, and stored. She was not rushing. She was calculating. She knew her husband too well. His pride would blind him until the very end. That blindness would be her weapon. The beginning of retribution was not loud. It was not dramatic. It was quiet, patient, and deliberate. It was the calm before the storm, the gathering of clouds on the horizon. The world still pitied her, but soon they would see her differently. Soon, the woman who had been pushed into the sea would rise with the tide, carrying the weight of justice in her hands. While the woman healed in silence and built her case in secret, her husband strutted across the city as if he had already won. The scandal that burned on screens around the world seemed to fuel him rather than shame him. To him, outrage was nothing more than background noise. He was convinced that wealth could bury truth, and that power could silence judgment. At parties and clubs, he appeared with his mistress at his side. She wore diamonds he had bought with stolen money, her laughter sharp and mocking as cameras flashed. Together they posed as if untouchable. He whispered to investors that his wife was fragile, that she would never recover, that she would soon be gone and forgotten. He told them she had no influence, no strength, and no allies. They believed him because he spoke with the confidence of a man who had never faced consequences. His arrogance grew louder with every headline. When reporters asked about the incident on the yacht, he smirked. He claimed it was exaggerated, that his wife had slipped, that guests had misunderstood. He dismissed the footage as edited, a trick by enemies who envied his success. He dared the world to challenge him, standing tall in front of microphones with the poise of a man who thought himself invincible. His mistress reveled in his confidence. She mocked the wife openly, telling friends that she was the new face of his empire. She promised that soon the world would forget the fragile woman in the hospital bed. She believed she was stepping into a crown, replacing a queen who had been cast aside. Her arrogance mirrored his, feeding his pride and blinding him further. Yet beneath the glamour, cracks were forming. Investors who once cheered his every move now hesitated. Banks began to question the irregularities in his accounts. Journalists whispered about deeper scandals waiting to be revealed, but he brushed it all away. He told himself the world had always bowed to him, and it always would. He paraded through offices, reminding employees of his authority, threatening anyone who dared to question his orders. He doubled down on lavish spending, hosting banquets, ordering champagne towers, and boasting that nothing could topple him. The more the world doubted, the more he performed. Each act was theater, each smile a mask, each laugh a declaration that he was untouchable. But what he did not see was the silence of his wife. He mistook it for weakness. He believed her absence from the public eye meant surrender. He never imagined that her silence was filled with planning, that every day she remained quiet was another day the noose around his empire tightened. The guests who had witnessed the yacht incident remembered. Their recordings spread further. Social media did not forget. The humiliation replayed across platforms, viewed millions of times, shared by strangers who had no connection to either of them. The world was not forgiving, but he told himself it was temporary, that people would always move on to the next scandal. He thought time was his shield. In truth, time was her weapon. While he grew careless, she grew patient. While he flaunted his arrogance, she gathered strength. His every appearance in public, every boast to the press, every cruel word against her was fuel for the fire that would consume him. The arrogance of the betrayer was not only his downfall, it was the stage upon which his destruction would be displayed. He had written his own script, playing the role of a king who mocked the storm. What he did not realize was that the storm had already formed, and it was moving silently, steadily, and inevitably toward him. The arrogance of the millionaire had reached its peak, but arrogance alone was not enough. He wanted more. He wanted the final act of humiliation, the strike that would crush his wife completely. In his mind, the scandal had already faded. In his mind, his wealth and power had silenced the noise. What he failed to see was that the world had not forgotten, and neither had she. He called the press to a small conference. Cameras gathered, microphones filled the table, and reporters leaned forward, ready to hear what he would say. His wife was still recovering, silent, hidden from the public eye. He thought this was his chance to bury her reputation forever. With a confident smirk, he announced his decision. He was filing for divorce. He would cut ties with her publicly, and he would do it with words sharp enough to pierce her dignity. He described her as weak, fragile, unworthy of his name. He told the world she had always been dependent on him, that she brought nothing to his empire, that she was a burden he had carried out of pity. He mocked her illness, laughed at her silence, and dared her to respond. The cameras recorded every word, and the audience watching around the world felt the cruelty in his voice. Beside him, his mistress stood proudly, smiling for the cameras, as if the throne had already been handed to her. She leaned against his shoulder, her jewelry catching the light, her eyes glittering with arrogance. Together, they painted a picture of triumph, of betrayal made official. To them, it was victory. To the watching world, it was poison. The betrayal was not just personal. It was public, deliberate, and merciless. The man who had vowed to protect his wife now ridiculed her in front of millions. He thought the narrative was his to control. He thought people would believe him because of his wealth and power. But the reaction was not what he expected. The crowd outside the conference shouted in anger. Protesters raised signs demanding justice, their voices echoing through the streets. Online, the videos spread again, now paired with his cruel words. His image, once polished and untouchable, now burned with the stain of arrogance and betrayal. Even those who had once supported him began to question his morality. Investors grew uneasy. Business partners looked away. In the hospital room, the woman watched the broadcast in silence. Her parents sat beside her, their faces hardening with every word. She felt the sting of betrayal, deeper than any wound to her body. But she also felt something else. His cruelty no longer broke her. It fueled her. Each insult, each lie, each arrogant declaration became another brick in the wall she was building against him. The lawyer at her side took notes. Every word he spoke in that press conference became evidence, another weapon in the arsenal they were preparing. His arrogance had blinded him so much that he did not realize he was handing her the very tools that would destroy him. The betrayal cut deep, but it also revealed the truth to the world. People no longer saw her as a silent victim. They saw her as a woman wronged, a mother humiliated, a figure who deserved justice. The sympathy that grew around her was no longer just pity. It was outrage. Outrage that demanded change. Outrage that demanded accountability. The millionaire walked away from the cameras convinced of his victory. He believed he had erased her. He believed his betrayal had silenced her forever. But he was wrong. What he had done was not the end. It was the spark before the explosion. The ultimate betrayal was not only a wound, it was the turning point. And soon, the man who believed he had buried his wife would discover that betrayal always carries a price, and his was coming fast. The day of the Grand Economic Conference arrived. The hall was filled with leaders, investors, and journalists. Cameras lined the stage, ready to capture every word that could shake markets and alter futures. For weeks, the millionaire had walked with pride, boasting that his wife was gone, that she was silent, that she had no power left. But on this day, in this hall, his illusion was about to shatter. The crowd hushed as the lights dimmed. The announcer called the next speaker, and a collective gasp swept the room. It was her, the woman everyone thought broken, the wife who had been pushed into the sea, the figure he had mocked and humiliated. She stepped onto the stage with measured grace, her dark dress flowing with authority, her eyes steady, every camera turned, every phone lifted. The silence was electric. The millionaire froze in his seat. His smirk vanished, replaced by disbelief. His mistress shifted uncomfortably, sensing the storm. The audience leaned forward, sensing history in the making. She placed a stack of documents on the podium. Her voice, calm but resolute, carried across the hall. She did not shout. She did not need to. Each word was sharp enough to cut through the air. She revealed evidence of his financial misconduct, hidden accounts, fraudulent transfers, contracts signed under false pretenses. Screens lit up behind her, displaying copies of his own signatures, his own schemes exposed for the world to see. Gasps echoed as journalists scribbled furiously, cameras zooming in on every page. She did not stop there. She revealed video clips of the night, on the yacht, unedited, undeniable. The crowd relived the horror, the push, the splash, the cold command to continue the party. Every detail played on the giant screens, stripping away the last fragments of his defense. And then came the final blow. She declared her identity not as his dependent wife, but as the heir and majority shareholder of the very empire he claimed as his own. She produced certificates of ownership, legal documents, and board resolutions that confirmed her control. The company, the fortune, the power, all of it was tied to her name, not his. The hall erupted. Reporters shouted questions. Investors murmured in disbelief. His empire was not his after all. The man who had ridiculed her, who had cast her aside, who had paraded his mistress as a replacement, now sat pale and speechless. He had been dethroned in public, his arrogance crushed under the weight of truth. Her parents rose from their seats in the front row, their presence a reminder that she was not alone. They stood as pillars of strength, witnesses to the moment their daughter reclaimed her dignity and her power. The audience, once skeptical, now applauded. Some stood, clapping with respect, others with relief. Justice, at least in part, was unfolding before their eyes. The millionaire tried to rise, to speak, but his voice was drowned by the crowd. He reached for the microphone, but the journalists shouted louder, questions cutting through his attempt to recover. His mistress slipped away quietly, her smile gone, her glittering jewelry suddenly meaningless. The woman did not gloat, she did not smirk. She stood tall, collected, and unshaken. Her silence in the hospital had been misread. Her absence from the public had been miscalculated. This was never weakness. This was strategy. The unexpected reversal was complete. The man who once believed himself untouchable now sat cornered, his lies exposed, his fortune slipping away. The woman he had betrayed had risen from humiliation to triumph, and the world bore witness. The conference hall had witnessed the fall, but justice did not end with applause. Truth had been spoken, evidence had been revealed, and now the machinery of consequence began to turn. Once the cameras stopped flashing, once the audience left buzzing with disbelief, officials stepped forward. They carried papers stamped with authority. They carried orders that could not be silenced. Within hours, investigators entered the offices of the Millionaire. They did not knock politely. They did not arrive as guests. They came as enforcers of the law. The staff froze as the sight of badges and uniforms filled the lobby. Documents were seized, computers were taken, and files that had been hidden behind locked doors were brought into the light. His empire, once guarded by arrogance and intimidation, was now vulnerable. Banks received calls, accounts were frozen, properties were marked for seizure. Transactions that had once flowed freely now came to a halt. What took years to build began to collapse in a single day. Screens that once displayed rising profits now glowed red with warnings of loss. Investors withdrew, one after another, their trust shattered by the revelations. The media did not relent. Headlines screamed of betrayal, fraud, and abuse. His face, once polished and admired, now appeared under banners of disgrace. Nightly news anchors repeated his words, his insults, his arrogance, alongside the images of his wife standing tall with documents in her hand. Public opinion was no longer split, it was united against him. His allies disappeared. Lawyers hesitated to answer his calls. Business partners avoided his name. Even his mistress, once proud to stand at his side, vanished from his mansion without a word. The arrogance that had carried him through every scandal now left him stranded. He was a man isolated, abandoned, and despised. Meanwhile, the courts prepared. The lawsuits filed against him grew thicker by the hour. Civil charges, criminal investigations, and shareholder actions piled on top of one another. Each case was a thread, and together they formed a rope pulling him down. Judges signed orders, prosecutors gathered witnesses, and the foundation of his empire turned to sand beneath his feet. The humiliation that began on a yacht was now complete in the eyes of the law. He had believed himself untouchable, but the gavel was louder than his voice. His name, once spoken with respect, became a cautionary tale. He was no longer a symbol of wealth. He was a symbol of arrogance, punished. The woman watched from the quiet of her home, surrounded by her parents and trusted allies. She did not smile at his downfall. She did not need to. The sight of justice moving swiftly was enough. She knew the road was not over, but she also knew the tide had turned. He was no longer the predator. He was the prey. The city, once blinded by his charm, now saw him clearly. Crowds gathered outside courthouses holding signs that demanded accountability. Journalists camped outside his mansion, capturing every stumble, every desperate attempt to regain control. The man who had once thrown his wife into the sea now drowned in the weight of his own corruption. Justice was not gentle. It stripped him of wealth, reputation, and authority. It left him exposed, vulnerable, and despised. And for the first time in his life, he faced a world that would not bend to his will. The judgment of justice was not just the loss of money or status. It was the collapse of an empire built on cruelty and lies. And the world, watching closely, understood the message. Arrogance has limits. Power has boundaries. And no man, no matter how wealthy, can escape the tide of truth forever. The storm of scandal and judgment had passed, but its echoes remained. The mansion once filled with arrogance now stood empty. The empire built on greed had crumbled into dust. What remained was not his power, but her strength. And as the sun rose over the horizon, the story no longer belonged to the man who had fallen. It belonged to the woman who had endured, who had survived, and who had risen. She walked slowly along the shore, the sand soft beneath her feet, the ocean calm, as if offering peace after chaos. The waves that had once threatened to consume her now whispered gently at her ankles. Her hand rested on her stomach, feeling the quiet rhythm of life within. Every step she took was steady, a declaration that she was no longer a victim. She was a survivor. She was the heir to a legacy of power, and more importantly, the guardian of a future that would not be shaped by cruelty. Her parents walked beside her, their presence firm and protective. Her mother's hand brushed her arm, a silent gesture of comfort. Her father walked with the quiet authority of a man who had seen justice prevail, his eyes proud yet humble. Together, they formed a picture of unity, a family restored after the storm. The city that once whispered rumors now spoke her name with respect. Reporters who had doubted her now praised her strength. Strangers who had pitied her now saw her as a symbol of resilience. She had endured humiliation before the world, but she had not allowed it to break her. She had transformed her pain into power, her silence into strategy, her suffering into strength. In the distance, the sound of seagulls filled the air, their cries echoing over the waves. She paused, looking out at the horizon where the sun painted the water gold. That same ocean that had nearly taken her life now reflected her triumph. It no longer represented fear, it represented renewal. She thought of the man who had betrayed her, now stripped of wealth, allies, and reputation. She felt no need for vengeance in that moment. His downfall was complete, and it had been of his own making. He had written his story with arrogance, and he had paid the price. She did not need to look back at him. The future was in front of her, shining with the promise of a new dawn. The child within her moved, a small flutter beneath her hand. She whispered softly, words carried away by the sea breeze. Promises of love, of protection, of a life defined not by pain but by hope. She would raise this child with the lessons she had learned, lessons of courage, justice, and dignity. As the waves touched her feet, she closed her eyes for a moment. The silence was no longer heavy. It was peaceful. She breathed deeply, filling her lungs with salt, air, and strength. She knew the road ahead would not be simple. Power always comes with responsibility. But she also knew she was ready. The triumphant ending was not just about justice delivered or an empire reclaimed. It was about a woman who refused to be erased. It was about a family standing together in the light of dawn. And it was about a future, symbolized by the child she carried, that would be born from truth rather than lies. As the sun climbed higher, she opened her eyes and continued walking along the shore. The world had seen her fall, the world had seen her rise, and now the world would remember her not as a victim, but as a victor.